Good afternoon, everyone. It's Pat Wright. I know that you probably cannot see anyone on the screen. You see the PowerPoint. That is because the web cameras are not working, although I see something popping up now. Welcome to our webinar on understanding the latest guidance on evaluation from the New Jersey Department of Education. I want to take a minute, as I always do, for everybody on the call to thank you for everything that you are doing in the field. It is miraculous what you are doing to get schools and to get students learning this year. So really, thank you so much for everything that you're doing. I want to take a minute to thank Pete Mazzagatti from the department for being here today. We really appreciate his participation in this. And I want to thank Dave Nash, our Director of Legal One, for putting this together. Also on the call, we have John Farinella, who is here, one of our attorneys at N.J.S.A. and just recently retired from a principalship. So he knows what he is speaking of. He is well experienced and knows exactly what you're experiencing now. So I'm going to turn it over right now to Dave Nash.
Thank you so much, Pat, and thank you everyone for taking time out of your schedules to work with us on this very complicated set of issues related to evaluation. We want to try to help you understand some of the evolving standards, the new guidance that we have from the New Jersey Department of Education. And there's really no better person for us to have with us for this presentation than Pete Mazzagatti. Dr. Mazzagatti is with the department's Office of Professional Learning. He's been there for the past 6 years. He is the primary author of the latest guidance that's come from the Department of Education and is going to walk us through that today. He comes to his current role with the department with a wealth of experience. He spent 13 years in education as a high school social studies teacher in South Jersey, and then as a district humanities. While he was serving in those capacities, his school district worked very closely with the Department of Education as a pilot district, looking at evaluation, and it was through that work that Pete eventually found his way to the Department of Education. And as Pat mentioned, we also have with us John Farinella. John, we're thrilled to have now as NJPSA legal counsel. John, for many years, was high school principal in the Rahway School District and brings that very practical experience to his work now as NJPSA counsel. As we work through our presentation today, keep in mind you all will receive a follow-up email in 24 hours or so with a recording of today's presentation and the PowerPoint. So you will have access to the PowerPoint, you will have the recording. Of course, as we walk through our issues today, we will touch on a number of legal issues, and we do invite you to type questions in. You do have the option to do that as we go today. As we respond, of course, we're not giving legal advice on any particular topic. We're trying to give you the best information available. But with that being said, we do encourage you, please type in your questions. As we have more than 500 folks registered, it's unlikely we're going to be able to respond to all of your questions, but we will save those questions and they will be forwarded to the department, and they'll be very helpful for us in moving forward and trying to address your concerns. This just provides a quick preview of what we're going to walk through today, walking through and reminding you of some statutory and regulatory requirements related to evaluation, key elements of the department's guidance, including both requirements and some best practice considerations. Obviously, we're going to talk about some unique challenges that we're all struggling with related to coronavirus, and some unique issues that we should think about when it comes to staff who may be on a corrective action plan, staff who may be non-tenured in the process of acquiring tenure, and staff members who, for a variety of reasons last year, may have received either an NE rating or no rating at all. So lots of different twists that we want to make sure that folks understand. So with that, let me turn it over to Pete. We are so thrilled to have Dr. Mazzagatti with us. And thanks so much, Pete, for being here.
Thank you, David. You can hear me?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
And thanks to Pat for having me, and all of you for spending time with us today. I do want to go over with you here, start out some of the basic requirements of Teach NJ and the accompanying Chapter 10 regulations before getting into the guidance. I do want to say to you as well that this is kind of part of a bit of a road show I'm doing virtually right now. I've been speaking to a lot of curriculum consortiums and superintendents roundtables, and I have quite a few more coming up. We are seeing some themes and some questions that are coming up here. So I would imagine that a lot of the questions you have, we'll be able to answer for you today. As I always say to people, you know, we're providing guidance for close to 600 districts across the state. And there are many unique situations or many unique questions that come up. So if there are some we have to get back to, we certainly will. Finally, my email is at the end of this, and I'll tell you, like I tell anybody else that I've ever spoken to, please feel free to contact me with things. We can certainly, you know, try to help you work through some of the issues you may be seeing as well. So we'll start out here with some things as laid out in Teach N.J.A. Act and accompanying Chapter 10 regulations. As we see the definition here of evaluation and observations, I do want to kind of highlight the definition of observations here. As a method of collecting data on the performance of a teaching staff member's assigned duties and responsibilities. That is laid out in Chapter 10, and it is really the kind of the linchpin definition here that has allowed us to do many things, such as the highly effective model, such as our evaluations for principals, emergency regulations that we had released last year during the COVID-19 building shutdowns, and as well as our guidance surrounding portfolios, which we'll be talking to you about today. So we take a look here with tenured staff versus non-tenured staff. There have been some questions when it says it replaces the traditional 20-minute observation. I understand some school districts still use the old short and long observations that would have been relevant in 2013. In 2016, we amended Achieve NJ, so now all observations are required to be a minimum of 20 minutes. You certainly can observe longer than 20 minutes, but the minimum of 20 minutes is still applicable today in Achieve NJ, which is why we refer to it as a traditional 20-minute observation. For tenured staff, that is two observations. For non-tenured staff, it's 3. Remember, everybody has to have multiple measures and multiple observations, which is why we require at least 2. And then finally, unannounced and announced observations with pre-conferences are also required. Post-conferences are required after each observation, as well as face-to-face, with at least 1 face-to-face for tenured and 15 teaching staff member working, within 15 teaching staff member working days. And just briefly on this, well, I have had some questions come up and say, well, you know, we're remote or we're not trying to be in the same room. Can we do these via telecommunications similar to this? Yes, that's face-to-face. That is well within regulations. So you can certainly have those conferences on Zoom or some kind of a platform. In addition, I'll be talking about this later, but those pre-conferences and post-conferences, if you are doing an observation window in a portfolio, that the pre-conference needs to occur before the portfolio window would open, and then the post-conference would occur 15 staff member working days following the closing of whatever the agreed upon window is. And then finally, mid-year evaluation is required for any teaching staff member receiving a partially effective, ineffective summit evaluation or a corrective action plan. So that is part of that as well. You have a lot of local discretion. I'm going to do my best to point out local discretion and local flexibilities as we get to these points here as well. As far as additional observations going occurring and within observations, things like evidence and such. But you know, you will have unannounced and announced. You will have things being preceded by a pre-conference, and of course, you can also have observations longer than 20 minutes. And one of the main reasons here today for us being together is what we're taking a look at as far as the evaluation of virtual or remote instruction in the COVID-19 era. Some key dates here that are similar this year or the same this year as it would to any other year, notifying the policies and procedures by October 1st. All goals and PDP plans and such by October 31st. That includes corrective action plans. And then for any staff hired afterwards, those PDPs need to be developed within 30 days following the first official day of the district SGO set within 30 days as well. So getting into why we are here today, we will start out with Executive Order 175. That was released on August 13th. And essentially, as far as Achieve N.J.A is concerned, that essentially waived MSGP requirements this year, okay? And largely because there was no state test last year, so there was no method of showing that growth. So that is the only regulation that has been waived for this year. And it has essentially affected weightings. It's also affected certain teachers now who would previously have had one SGO. Now, because they have to have multiple measures of student achievement, we're requiring 2 SGOs for all teachers. And here we see what this meant in the weighting. Basically, everything defaulted to what we've had for non-tested subject grade levels, teachers and principals as well. In the past, it would have been 85-15 for that. Now it's 85-15 for everyone. In the past, it would have been 80-10-10 with that SGO average being added in for the principals, APs, and VPs. Same thing, same for everybody now this year. Okay, so getting into really why we're here today, and that is the guidance that was recently released. Some highlights of it. We're going to be talking about observations. We're going to be talking about what we would consider to be traditional observations versus hybrid instructional models versus fully remote models as well. And we will see here as we go through this, we're pivoting from what we would consider to be a traditional in-class person observation, which guidance essentially says it's the same for that plus hybrid. And then the portfolio process, which would come in to play when we get to a fully remote situation, if indeed those need to occur. And then finally, as this was stated earlier, the student achievement component for teachers will be satisfied solely by student growth objectives. All guidance that we've released on student growth objectives fall within normal regulations and their best practices that I'm sure many of you have seen me present before because I've done hundreds of trainings on those over the years. These are best practices that we've been talking about for quite some time, and we will go over some of them during the day today as well. Okay, so the guidance itself, I'm sure you've had a chance to take a look at it, is divided into 5 themes. I would imagine the majority of your questions, the majority of the questions I've received so far up to this, and the majority of the time we'll be spending on themes 1 and 2. Theme 1 is observations and conferencing processes. Theme 2 is SGOs. We'll go over themes 3, 4, and 5, but we're going to really kind of spend a lot of our time, most of our time, digging into the observation piece, which is theme 1. So once again, those requirements, all staff receiving the number of observations required by regulations. And here's where we kind of break it down here versus the traditional to the portfolio process and the appendix as well. So traditional in-class observations, which we define as in-class, in-person instruction. So the teacher's in his or her classroom, the kids are in their classroom with them. It is a traditional, normal situation they've been doing since the beginning of their careers, and God willing, after the careers as well. That's what we're defining as traditional in-class, in-person. This includes hybrid models, because hybrid models also have kids in class, in person. Even if everything goes perfectly this year, right? And we get a vaccine and we're able to return to instruction and such. There's good chance that we're going to have students throughout the entire year who are going to be at home. So in essence, teachers are going to be going through a bit of a hybrid model anyway, even if they only have 1 or 2 students who may be at home at that time. So we are looking at hybrid models to be considered the same as those traditional in-class, in-person instruction. The departure is when a teacher is in a different place than their students. So we have the teacher, like my wife, either teaching from her classroom where the students are all at home, or the teacher is at home and the students are at home as well. That is where the portfolio process comes into play for those fully remote situations. And there's a bunch of stuff on the portfolio appendix guidance. I'm going to go over some of the highlights right now with you here to really kind of define some things that we've seen as questions which have come up. So first things first here, when we take a look, and Dave, we're going to stop on this slide for a few minutes here, but portfolios are defined as a collection of evidence. One thing that I've come up more than once is People have been looking at the portfolio process and equating it to what we have for highly effective educators, wherein essentially we have the reflective practice protocol where there's student voice that's involved and where there is videotaping of lessons and such. This is not what we're talking about with this portfolio process. That still remains as an option for highly effective educators. As we talk about portfolios, what we're largely talking about is a collection of evidence. And evidence itself is something which has always been inherent to these observation instruments, even before this entire thing had occurred here. If you take a look, for example, at Danielson domains 1 and 4, at Marshall domains 1 and 6, McCrell domains 1 and 5, all of these have an evidence component to it for things that are not necessarily be able to observe in class. And I would argue that just about, if not all of them, have those evidence components. In addition to that, observation instruments have places where you can attach evidence, whether they're unit plans or lesson plans or assessments and these kinds of things. That is what we're talking about as far as the inclusion of evidence in a portfolio. So as we go through a little more about what this should look like here, I want to point out a lot of the flexibilities that you have that we have talked about in the guidance, and that I think we can kind of point out here to really kind of show you that what we're really looking for here really isn't a different thing than might be required during a normal observation. We talk about first local flexibilities. First off, windows of time. Portfolios are to be collected over windows of time themselves. And in the guidance, it says this can be as simple as, a couple of weeks up to a couple of months. We want to show you the flexibility that you have here as far as how long it would take or how long of a time you would have to collect this evidence. It does not have to be a long time. We're not looking for a portfolio that's very large or cumbersome, which also gets us into the local flexibility of the amount of evidence required. And I'll get back to the synchronous, asynchronous piece in a moment. We're talking here about, as far as evidence goes, as little as 1 piece per domain observed, no more than 4 or 5 per in any kind of a way. We're not looking for a large portfolio. We're really taking a look at evidence of this remote instruction what is happening in remote teaching and learning. But to start out here, let's take a look at what is required as far as the portfolio goes. It must include what we will call representation of what is occurring in class. Okay, so that is either evidence of synchronous or asynchronous remote instruction. Had some people contact us and say, look, my teachers union's okay with it. We're okay with it. We would like to go in and see what's happening in classrooms themselves. Certainly can, and that's actually required as part of the evidence itself. So going in, observing a class for 20 minutes of it, either in a synchronous manner where you join the Zoom or whatever other platform it is and see the teacher working with students, or if they're doing something similar to a Khan Academy where they have asynchronous remote lessons that are pre-recorded and students are looking at. You can look at that for that in-class instruction. That's the focal point, or the one piece of the evidence that you would be using. In addition to that, then you take a look at other things that might be that would have been occurring that are part of their job responsibilities. And here I'm leaning once again on that definition of observation, which is that it is a definition of job responsibilities of the educator itself. Because we take a look at remote learning right now and then remote teaching and learning, it's a different animal. There are many different ways that they're gauging students' engagement, that they're monitoring students, that they're assessing students. There's back channels that are happening between teachers and students. There's unique ways that students are being provided extra support online. There's student blogs and discussion boards and such. There's evidence of what's happening in breakout rooms. These are the pieces of evidence that can be collected that can create more of a picture of what's happening in the classroom itself. And really be part of that coaching piece. That's the other part of the evaluation model or the evaluation system, in order to help them along as they are really kind of learning about this different form of instruction. So that is what we are looking for ultimately as far as the portfolio process goes. And really it's a collection of this evidence that is assigned to the duties and responsibilities associated in teaching in a remote setting, and that facilitates a conversation regarding educators' growth during the specified window, which is what all good observations, or well, all observations in any kind of our guidance that we've produced has stated in the past. Now, one more piece of local flexibility I do want to point out, then I'll pause for a moment if any immediate questions have come up or clarifications is needed. I'll ask John or David if they can help me with that. You
Sure.
also have local flexibility on indicators which are observed. This happens in any kind of an observation, and we see this, for example, in Danielson, where most Danielson districts will look at domain 1 in the first observation, domain 4 in the last, and but not domain 1 in the last, domain 4 in the first. You don't have to include every domain or every indicator in the domain in every single observation, especially if it doesn't make sense for the online portion of it, such as I've been pointing to the example, organization of physical space. That might not attune itself to an online observation, so you certainly don't have to include indicators that don't lend itself well to it, and that's flexibility you also have. So I'll pause for a moment here. John or David, anything that we want to add at this moment or clarify?
Well, I think if I'll jump in, and I will say I think your comments about flexibility are very significant. And the flexibility process is really a conversation between the evaluator and the teacher. And I think it's an opportunity for you to focus on areas that you both agree on are areas where you could really help a teacher grow. So it's an opportunity. Every time something happens, it creates a new way to take a look at what we're doing. And certainly that's what's happening here now. And I think if we take these opportunities and work with the people, and every person and every relationship between an evaluator and a teacher is different, if we play up the pieces that we really need to and work on those, we'll get some benefit from the work we're doing this year.
So just to hone in, there were specific questions about whether statute allows for collecting evidence of synchronous or asynchronous remote instruction. Certainly as part of a portfolio process, that is something that can be included. It does not violate any specific statutory requirement to say we're going to include that, as long as it's not the entire picture. Obviously, as part of a portfolio, you're looking at other pieces of evidence as well. So I think it's important to clarify that point, that it is permissible, it just can't be everything in that portfolio.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And I go back to the idea here of what the definition of an observation is. So the portfolio itself, we have opportunities to show the evidence of the complete picture, because there is that coaching conversation, and there is that look at everything a teacher's doing, which is much more complex, and it's a learning process for them in many ways right now. And it offers the ability to learn and to get better at this, but because many of these kids are going to be in this situation remotely potentially all year itself. And I keep going back, and this is some of these kids' only time with algebra, or in the Spanish 1 class, or whatever else it may be. And reaching them and really being the best at reaching them is critical, and that can happen with that feedback piece.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So we'll end up pausing a little on this slide too, as you could imagine, Pete, but why don't you walk through this?
Yeah, absolutely. So first starts out with hybrid models. When we take a look at hybrid models, they are to be observed as the same as an in-class, in-person observation, okay? And I understand that there are so many different hybrid models that are existing out there, and I've talked to certain districts who, and largely due to people opting to keep their kids at home, almost have more kids at home than they have in the classroom, and all these kinds of things as well. So, but again, the hybrid model, because we have a teacher teaching in class with students, is going to be looked at as that traditional in-class, in-person observation. But that does not necessarily mean you can't provide feedback to what's happening outside as well. You are certainly within your rights and welcome and encouraged to provide feedback for both in-class students as well as remote students, and even collect evidence for ways remote students are being engaged or they're being kept in the class as well. is as in the collection of all students. So in those hybrid models, even though the basis of it is an in-class, in-person observation, we still are going to recognize that there are students that aren't there, and that evidence should be collected for those students, and that we should be providing feedback for how we're reaching them and incorporating them in the class while they're not physically in the class at that time. Anybody want to, John or David, any questions? Or want to add anything to that before we move to the other flexibility that's come up?
No, I think that's clear. I think that's very helpful to talk through that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're in a good place with this, and this will evolve, I think, as groups get better at it. And I will say this about the SIP. The SIP serves many functions, but perhaps this year one that's very different from the past is that the SIP really can be an organization or a think tank inside the context of the school to vet some of the considerations going on with observation and evaluation from a technical standpoint and from an opportunity standpoint in terms of what is working and what is not working, which we probably didn't do as much in the past.
And the other thing that I would say is that, we do have an ongoing duty of care to all of our students. So of course, a teacher or a counselor or an administrator, if you're seeing something that might concern you with a student who's remotely participating in the class, obviously, we have to address those issues that we're seeing. So there is a duty of care that we all have if we see anything that concerns us with a student who's involved in remote instruction, including a student who just might not be engaging. That says something, we don't know what yet, but it says we need to follow up and figure out what's happening with that student. Why are they not engaging the way we would hope?
Absolutely. And John, I'd like to piggyback. I'm glad you brought up the skips, and we talk a bit about skips and DEAC or DEAC-like bodies. And when we get into that theme a little later, I'll kind of hit a couple of those points too. But as we get to this next point, bringing in your stakeholders, and this was in our guidance under this theme as well as others, is key not only in making initial decisions, but also in reconvening and getting some feedback, taking a temperature. How are things going? Do we need to pivot in a certain kind of a way? What are we hearing? How are teachers feeling about this? Because there will be tweaks to the process if we're getting feedback to make it better as we move forward.
Agreed.
Okay, so moving then to the next piece here, and this piece has come up a few times recently, and this is potential flexibility for conducting in-person evaluation remotely rather than physically being in the classroom. A lot of this has been stated under health concerns, which are obviously abound here in this situation. But we've been contacted recently by several districts, and we understand with these numerous health concerns about having people move classroom to classroom to conduct observations. First off, I will say, as far as observations go, one thing you take a look at is multiple observers. Multiple observers are only required for those teachers who are corrective action plans or those teachers who are non-tenured. So keeping a same observer for one teacher is one way to have less people in and out of classrooms. But even greater concern is, well, can we find a way to keep them out of the classroom to be able to conduct these observations? So districts have contacted us, they discuss locally about conducting what we have defined as an in-class, in-person evaluation, but doing so in an observer remote rather than physically being in the classroom through a camera or something. So we are offering potential flexibility aligned with the portfolio option to conduct observations this way, as long as the following has occurred and stated defined. A, key stakeholders are in agreement, just as we have stated with portfolios. So just mentioned a minute ago, DEACs and skips, so we vetted that. And evidence other than the observation notes are utilized, again, as we have stated in portfolios, once again, taking a look at that evidence itself. This observation still requires the evidence, but it also acknowledges the fact that you're conducting an observation of a traditional classroom setting. As far as evidence goes, remember, what is being observed could still be a pure hybrid situation. Probably is if there are students who are participating from home in any way. Camera only sees so much. The incorporation of evidence is still a necessary component in this situation. So, this process is aligned with portfolio guidance, where both the teacher and supervisor are in agreement that there'll be synchronous instruction observed remotely, and that's part of the agreement that's made with stakeholders if you're going to go this route. And finally, we would also say, as any other time, place in the classroom, make sure the teacher is aware that at the time it's happening, they are being observed remotely in a classroom, just as they would if you were coming in traditional observation. They would see you there, or if you were observing remote teaching through a Zoom link or some other online platform, they will be aware that they're being observed at that time.
So this particular flexibility option, I think is critical, given the public health concerns that we have in New Jersey and across the nation. So making sure that folks understand this and some of the important points that you made, that it really does need to involve engaging all the stakeholders, reaching a local agreement, and making sure that we do this in a fair way, or adding in other evidence other than the observation. But it does provide an important avenue for us to address these issues without an administrator physically having to move from class to class for observations.
Yeah, and if I can just kind of wrapping up observations here, unless there's questions and such on it, those recommended processes at the bottom, I think, are really key. And again, John mentioned this before, but using a DIAC or DIAC-like committee, as well as skips in decision-making process, and in taking the temperature along the way is critical. Using evidence to support all types of observations. Again, we may call it a portfolio, but if it is as little as one per domain observed or whatnot, very similar to the process that you've gone through beginning, but we're really kind of recognizing the evidence itself through the lens of what remote teaching looks like, in an effort to see what's happening, as well as to promote the professional learning. And then finally, as always, and anybody that's seen me present, I'm going to, as long as I'm here, I'm going to keep hammering this home. Approaching evaluation through the lens of supporting educators in improving their practices and building upon their strengths is paramount. It's what I strongly believe, representing the department, this is about, because we're trying to really kind of improve practice, have these professional conversations, move teachers along the continuum here in order to reach our kids as best we can.
Absolutely.
So this moves us to theme 2, which is student growth objectives, which I've presented many times. I know is everybody's favorite thing. But when we take a look at student growth objectives themselves, what we take a look at here is the requirements that go along with them. And due to the absence of state assessment last year, as we said, there is no MSGP, and student achievement component will be satisfied by student growth objectives, as well as principals, assistant principals, and vice principals through their goals and the SGO average of teachers. With our recommendations, I'm not going to go through every single one as is written in guidance. They're detailed and can be found in the guidance. So I'm going to lay heavy on 3 points. And I'm going to say that we really want to look at great care in the developments of these. And as we always say with student growth objectives, any presentation I've ever done, any kind of a training, let's see what we can do to leverage these to learn as much about instruction as we can as we develop and implement them. So 3 main recommendations that come from those that come through those 5 steps themselves: baselining, setting targets, and making adjustments. We talk a little bit about developing proper assessments under step 1, that is in the guidance itself. But once we have those assessments, what it is that we are assessing along the way, we first take a look at baselining. We always talk about multiple measures to obtain baseline data for students. We have preached a long time against a pre-test, post-test model. And this year we're really kind of stressing, if ever we want to kind of move away from this, if you're still doing this practice, this is the year to definitely do that. You want to see where students are at, okay? Many of our students, it's not a summer slump, it was a 6-month slump, okay? Because they've been out of building since September itself. We don't know necessarily what was behind us, so taking a look at multiple measures to really kind of see where they were at is key in starting where kids are. I always use the example when I do these trainings of Spanish 2 versus Spanish 1. If I'm a Spanish 2 teacher, I want to know, do my kids know everything they should know from Spanish 1 in order to be prepared for the instruction I'm going to give them? So if I want to give some type of baseline assessment, it might be something diagnostic based upon what they should know leaving Spanish 1. And if there are clear gaps, that's where the teaching begins, right? You can also take a look at other things. You can take a look at current grades, how they've been doing so far, especially if they've been remote. You could take a look at how they ended up finishing up last year with grades. You could take a look at a parent survey to see how online learning went. Take a look at summer work. You can take a look at a first assessment. There are many different places you can kind of get a gauge here as far as figuring out where our students are, because from there you're going to set targets. And the targets are set, students are tiered in different tiers based upon their readiness, okay? And setting targets, as we always say, should be a thoughtful, realistic process. And we do have some districts who have approached target setting through a mandatory across the board score. Everybody's got to get 80%. We've always talked about moving away from that and taking a look at targets based upon student readiness and where they are. All students might not make it to 80%, especially if they are far behind itself. So setting targets based upon, you know, what we believe realistic growth would be based upon where we're at is especially critical this year. Keeping in mind that as much as we don't know what was behind us, we don't know what's ahead of us. Okay, you guys have been in school for a month now, and I'm sure you've already had so many things happen along the way. I mean, it's been 1 month in. So we're seeing where we're going to be potentially at in November, December, January. I mean, you know, we could, God forbid, have a school closed down or have a teacher have to go out because something's wrong, or have students in and out. We have students learning from home, students learning there. So setting targets this year is going to be especially difficult. So really kind of setting realistic targets based upon where they are is key this year. Then finally, the third major point here is the adjustment period. We signal that twice in the guidance. February 15th is the SGO deadline for adjustments. And normally we tell people, look, this is for great changes in population. You have a bunch of students drop out. You had a teacher potentially change a teaching assignment. Some data source came in which really showed that students were in a much different place than you thought they may have been. Those would be some areas for adjustment themselves. This would be a year where you might relax what counts as an adjustment. Okay, you might relax as far as what counts for what could an adjustment be. Because you may have changes in expectations and growth. You may have students who start out in class who end up going remote. There's all these different things which could happen. So using that adjustment period is something which we would strongly advise you might take a look at, potentially with an inclusion of a mid-year conference where you kind of talk about how the years went, and specifically include the SGO in that conversation. And by the way, a lot of times people contact me and say about the February 15th deadline. Just because it's February 15th does not mean you can't adjust prior to February 15th. So you want to keep that in mind. And finally, with baselines, with targets, and with adjustments, SGOs are teacher created, they're student centered, and they're administrator supported and approved. So administrators have the final say to these adjustments as well, and the final approval on them. Just want to let you know that flexibility is there, and especially in a year like this, it's probably a good time to really kind of take a look at these as we move forward.
So Pete, of course, with so many participants, we're getting some great questions. John, do you want to maybe flag a couple of the questions that have been coming in at this point?
Not seeing any on my.
Do we have any specific SGO stuff, or?
Yeah. Since there are no SGPs, do 4th and 5th grade teachers still need 2 SGOs?
Everybody gets 2. You need multiple measures in order to have, in order to do that, okay? Another question I have that I've gotten in, I just thought about this when I said this. So yes, you do need 2 for teachers who normally get an SGP. I've also had, our guidance always says, try to include the vast majority of the students and the vast majority of the standards. You know, and people are concerned about kids that are at home and you know, and they're not there for instruction, this and that kind of thing all the time. You don't have to include every single student in the SGO itself. I'm not saying we're going to ignore, we're not going to worry about kids at home or these kinds of things, but you do have local control as to which students to include and why in an SGO.
We are getting some interesting specific questions. One, what do we do when parents are assisting their children with SGO assessments so the data are not very accurate?
Yeah, so I would come right back with that and say, well, number one, I understand their assessments are tied to SGOs, but as far as, you know, SGO assessments themselves, I think we're probably in a similar circumstance with any kind of assessment, right? As far as potentially people assisting in these kinds of things. So that goes beyond SGOs. You know, so you got to take that into consideration as well. So yeah, I think that if we have that problem, that would be a greater problem with things other than just SGOs also.
Absolutely. What if we run into a situation where the local stakeholders are not in agreement regarding virtual observation? So, you know, you have two different twists on that. If you had a portfolio process, it seems to me that it would still need to occur as part of that portfolio process.
Yeah, so are we asking as far as the inclusion of the observation itself in the portfolio process, or just a general disagreement?
Yeah, so two pieces. One would be the inclusion in the portfolio. What if, you know, local association says, we disagree, you can do the rest of the portfolio, but you can't include evidence related to synchronous instruction?
So we say essentially, so first off, we stand behind our guidance and the importance of including what is happening in class as part of an observation itself, because even though remote instruction includes many other pieces, you know, the centerpiece of it is still the instruction, still what's happening, you know, those 40 minutes or whatnot that were with the kids themselves. We specifically state in the guidance the inclusion of either asynchronous or synchronous instruction. Part of the reason we put asynchronous in there as well is because there are people who is lessons that they go on. Those could be good representations and such. So, you know, they can agree on that, but some type of instruction, you know, must, or the inclusion of evidence in some type of instruction must be part of that portfolio.
Really, the agreement issue comes into play when you're talking about somebody who is in school, in person, providing instruction, and then you would want agreement with the local stakeholders before we conducted those observations remotely.
Yeah, those absolutely are going to have some type of agreement if you're going to have somebody, you know, zooming in or whatnot with an in-class, in-person instruction. But as far as the portfolio, I mean, the instruction, if you take a look at any of the instruments, for example, you know, that what's happening in class at that time is really, you know, the key component of teaching needs to be included as part of that portfolio.
And you probably said this, but we have various twists on this. Of course, you might have a teacher who's physically in the building, but it's doing all of the instruction remotely with students. So
that's a portfolio because again, it doesn't matter where they are. I mean, the students aren't with them. And because of that, it's similar to this right now. It's people in vastly different places across the state here who are participating in this, and it's just different, right? And there are so many things which are occurring as well, which would be part of a traditional typical lesson. I mean, if you take a look at in-class lesson, you know, when you're watching somebody, you can see how they control a classroom by the way they might move towards kids in a certain way, or their classroom procedures, or the way they greet kids at the door, or the way they call them out by names, or the way their group work procedures are and such. And those things might not come off as well when you're not in the class with them, but they can be supported by evidence, which paints that picture, shares the process, and helps us with the conversations, you know, moving forward.
I think this is clear, but there was a question, so just to clarify, if you have a fully remote teacher, you would have to have the same number of portfolios gathered as you would have had observations.
Yep, it's observations, and so each observation is a portfolio. And again, we're not talking about, oh God, I gotta go September to December, and then I gotta go January to March. I mean, if you want to have a longer one in some districts, and I've had people contact me and say we would like to go a little longer with the look because we're going to be out for the first 2 months. You have that local flexibility. We also understand as well, if you want to shorten it up and keep it closer from observation, just pick a few key pieces of evidence. Potentially it's centered around that lesson or what's been happening during that snapshot. That's allowable as well. We want to give you that flexibility.
I see a number of questions related to struggles folks are having with figuring out baseline data. The information can be very limited for students who have been away for a long period of time.
Yeah.
Any suggestions?
So, we mentioned a few on there. Listen, I think when you take a look at any kind of a class coming in, some type of diagnostic is always a good place to start as far as the prerequisite skills or knowledge they should have coming into a class. And I'll go back to the Spanish 1 versus Spanish 2. When you start out with Spanish 2, you are figuring that, hey, that there's some basic Spanish they might know. So it could be some type of a diagnostic based upon that. You could take a look at what's happening in the classroom the first month. Look at the grade book. Are this homework being completed? Are they participating in class? How they do on the first assessment that may have been given, the quiz grades and such. Get a temperature on how they're gauging that information up to that point. You could take a look at parent survey as far as how remote learning is going. If there was a summer reading assignment or some other type of summer work, that could be used as baseline data. So you want to kind of grab from different places just to see, okay, where are we at right now with these students, and what places are they in? And I think too, a lot of that baseline data, especially with some type of diagnostic pre-assessment, provides an opportunity because there might be some gaps in a particular class that you're like, well, everybody really had struggled with this. I better make sure we kind of go over this a little bit where I normally might not go over it.
Sure. So if you have some students who are on a semester schedule where they're completing a course, in half of a year, does that change our timelines for the SGO adjustment period?
Yeah, so if you take a look, the adjustment period itself, again, due dates are due dates. It does not matter it does not mean that you cannot adjust prior to whatever that due date is. So if it's February 15th, you're in a semester course, it's done January 10th or whatever else it may be, you set it early, you may adjust in November. I have people who do semester-based ones, and you can use the same assessment for 2 different populations and incorporate that as 2 SGOs. And I'll have them do the assessment for the first semester, I'll advise them, and then the data they get from the first kind of actually helps in instruction moving forward, because if there's certain gaps everyone didn't get, it helps them in revisiting that and potentially baselining the second half of students. I've talked to districts who are saying, hey, can we include the similar assessment? We have X amount of students at home versus X amount of students here, and have them be 2 separate populations and 2 SGOs. That would be great data, because essentially you're taking a look at how my kids at home did versus how my kids that were here with me the entire time did. So there's different ways we can do this in order not only to comply, but in addition to that, to be able to get some good data out of it. So you have local discretion for these things. These examples I didn't think about in my queue, but Trenton, I mean, these are things and discussions I've had with people, and we've worked on things and it worked. But those are all ways we can tackle this.
Great. So we should try to touch on a few more key points from the slides. I know we wanted to try to quickly at least hit all these points.
Yeah, so Training and procedural adjustments, we'll kind of bounce here real quickly, get to the next part of it. But the training procedures are required by regulations. People were contacting me in the summer what things were looking like, and we were. This is the direction we're moving. I said, look, you want to really kind of take a look at evidence itself, because evidence is always key in evaluations, and what evidence looks like is something which will assist you no matter what kind of a situation you're involved in. I would say though that when we take a look at any kind of thing with training moving forward, or any kind of thing with defining things, that again, you bring those DAC and skips together, not only at the beginning, but also throughout the year, to take the temperature of what's happening in buildings and across teaching staff as well. They also, DACs and skips, when in the way they're utilized, also be really good pipelines between administration and teachers, because they kind of become the voices, and they can say, hey, here's what we're hearing, you know, how could we adjust, or what are your thoughts on this, back and forth. One thing I would point out here on this, and I would stress at the end, is co-observations. And I've had different people ask me about co-observations. Remember, the co-observer and the observer, only one of them becomes the official evaluation. So I said, well, can they have a camera in for the second observer and have the observer in class itself? To satisfy a co-observation, if you want to keep bodies out of the room, that's more than fine. I've had people ask about, well, if we're doing portfolios, can we have a co-observation of a portfolio of evidence? If they have access to the same lesson to take a look at that, that's fine. So, you know, when you pay attention to co-observations and such, there are ways to take a look at this that you can not only satisfy the requirement, but respect health and safety standards, and be able to cull some good data from it.
So I would imagine the same flexibility you addressed earlier back on slide 16, you know, could apply here for co-observations, just as it would for observations if you're.
Yep.
Great.
Yeah. Engage educators in active dialogue, and we've kind of hit this theme a few times here, but just real quickly, I can't say enough about skips. Districts I work with who have highly functioning skips really seem to be kind of pumping along with Achieve NJ in a lot of aspects. Remember, skips are there for PD, they're there for struggling teachers, they're there for mentors. Those are the things that they're overseeing. They're great bodies to really kind of fish things through. If you still have a DAC, and based upon anecdotal data, it sounds like about half the districts do. Some of them convene them. You can have a DAC-like body take a look at these things as well, but use them to help disseminate information, as well as, you know, solicit feedback on policies and get the best foot moving forward here within your schools.
Some of the flexibility we talked about earlier when it comes to the potential virtual observations, of course, the same process could be followed, I would imagine, for an administrator who, as part of a reasonable accommodation because of medical issues, is working, but they're working from home.
Yeah.
Right. So that.
Yeah. So are you saying, as far as an admin working from home doing observations?
Yes. So that if we had the same stakeholder buy-in, and the person could virtually do the observation of teachers for in-person instruction.
That flexibility is available. I've had districts ask me about that. I said some strategies you can use with this are, you could certainly, if you have a certain amount of teachers who are at home, you could certainly shift those teachers to the person that's also virtual and have them handle the bulk of the portfolios. They could get more involved in the highly effective option ones, because those have a portfolio component too, and that can be handled remotely. If they're an administrator that is in responsibility of observing other administrators, they could take maybe more of a lion's share of that. They could also take a lion's share of other certificated staff, like coaches and these kinds of people who don't have student rosters, but a lot of their jobs lend themselves to a portfolio process. There are also ways to kind of shift some responsibilities in order to, you know, lighten the load on certain areas and you know, kind of take advantage of the flexibilities that are there.
Great.
And then connecting to professional learning here, and I'll just briefly talk about, we released this guidance last spring, I guess late last spring, early last summer, but we've had some questions on professional learning plans. If a teacher during a typical year goes out on maternity leave and doesn't come back for the year, goes out on medical leave and doesn't come back for the year, and does not receive a summative score. Our guidance then with PDPs are, well, you go on the latest one, and you can then have one goal that is connected to feedback from the last summative evaluation. Or you could have one goal attached to feedback from an observation from this past year, even if it wasn't connected necessarily to a summative score. Same thing is going to work here for most of our teachers from last year, because the vast majority did not receive summatives. You can go back to what would have been, I guess, the 18-19 summative and continue with that goal. Or you can cull data from an observation or two, or potentially SGOs, which were completed, but didn't officially count as far as their PD goal as well. So those PD plans are still connected to performance evaluations, and they're still above board as that, but you're also, really kind of, again, in the spirit of it, connecting evaluation to professional learning. CAPS themselves, and I think David's going, are you going to talk a little about CAPS before we leave, David?
Yep, I will.
Well, I'll kind of let David talk about CAPS, but we kind of know how that happened. But as far as PDPs go and such, we're still connecting it to professional learning. I would strongly suggest, if you're doing a second PD goal, that it does have something to do with remote instruction, or something along those kinds of lines as well, because that's something that all of our districts are kind of grappling with this year, connected to online platforms, these kinds of things. But as always, making PD relevant to the situation and to improving practice is the goal of it.
So we've stressed this throughout, of course, but we always have to make sure that our number one priority, as we're considering all these other issues, is protecting the health and safety of everyone involved in our schools. So having very clear protocols for any staff member who does have to or does go into a classroom, making sure that we're maintaining social distancing, making sure that we are wearing the mask, making sure that we are doing everything possible to minimize potential exposure is critical. And that is why the flexibility that we discussed is so important. The science tells us that you could obviously have asymptomatic individuals, and the last thing any of us would want is for an asymptomatic administrator or other staff member to unwittingly be, spreading potentially the virus. So we need to be very strong in our protocols related to health and safety. We know there's a danger of increased traffic coming in and out of classrooms. So as part of the protocols, we've had to think about hallway traffic and having students in many schools simply going in one direction. We need to think about the timing of entering and leaving in the same way, and making sure that we're controlling that traffic. So there is a critical need to work with all of our stakeholders and local associations to put in place those protocols to mitigate risk. And I think it's critical to reach those agreements in our local districts wherever possible to allow for the in-person observation to be done in that remote fashion. We've stressed this throughout, but as a matter of health and safety for everyone involved, it's just so important. We, of course, have tenure acquisition questions that have become complicated in this era as we're working through this pandemic. So every non-tenured teacher or administrator was required to receive a summative rating last year, just as they're required to do every year. And if the non-tenured person had not been evaluated twice prior to the statewide shutdown we had in March, those districts were very clearly told to reach out to the Department of Education. And I know, Pete, you did receive outreach from many districts that were in that situation and worked with them on this issue where they had not done the 2 observations. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, we spoke, yes, to people that were in the situation.
So there were lots of districts that did a great job. They reached out. The department worked well with them to make sure that those individuals still were able to receive a summative rating. We are hearing, unfortunately, that there are some individuals, despite that guidance, who still did not receive a summative rating. And of course, if you're a non-tenured administrator, a non-tenured teacher, and through no fault of your own, you didn't receive a summative rating, I think it's pretty clear that that should not in any way negatively impact you. That shouldn't be the thing that is costing you tenure, forcing you to have an extra year that you're serving. So we know that there are some open legal questions regarding tenure acquisition and those staff members who received an NE rating this past year. But as a guiding principle, nothing that has happened in this past year should be negatively impacting an individual when they did not receive a summative rating because something fell through the cracks. So, you know, I'm saying this from our point of view from NJPSA, how critical it is that we make sure that every person has received that summative rating and that we're not in any way using that against an individual. Because as a non-tenured person, you know, you're doing what you can in this process, and you can't control whether someone is giving you a summative rating or not. So we're flagging that issue because we know it's important. We didn't want it to fall through the cracks. Your guidance last year, Pete, last spring, was pretty clear on this issue that districts need to reach out to the department if for some reason somebody did not receive that summative rating. So I do want to mention, I know we're up against the clock.
Can I ask a question, or am I allowed to? I don't know if you can
Yes,
hear
Bob
me.
Schwartz. Bob is our chief legal counsel. Bob, why don't you go ahead, ask a question?
Yeah, so I have a question on that. If you're non-tenured, and as David just put it, through no fault of your own, you don't get the summative rating, and then the district turns around and says, because you didn't get the summative rating, you can't accrue tenure. What's the position of the DOE on that?
So, David, do me a favor, correct me here. I know they have the exact, you know, the language down pat on this as
Sure.
far as what years they need to have those summative ratings.
Yeah, for an administrator, you have to have a positive rating, either effective or highly effective in years 2 and 3 for, and 2, 3, and 4. For a teacher, you have to have a positive rating in 2 of the 3 years after your first year in the district. So it's a slightly different administrator. You have to have it consecutive years. And for a teacher, it's 2 out of the last 3 years that you're non-tenured.
So that's how the official language is. And as far as how everything, before I answer your question, as far as how everything moved with this last year, we had some districts as the year was getting late and people contact us and say, hey, I read this guidance and this and that. I said, look, we'll work with the district to find a way to get these done. David, have you heard there've been a lot of people that still fell through the cracks, even though?
Well, not a lot, but there are people who we know have fallen through the cracks and have not received a summative rating. Again, it wasn't through any fault of their own. They just, the guidance was not followed and the district did not reach out and that person did not get a summative rating.
Dr. Mazzagatti, this is Bob Schwartz. I can tell you, I received quite a few phone calls from people who didn't have observations, non-tenured, didn't have observations, and then the district didn't call the DOE at all, and just left it alone. And they're, as far as I'm concerned, they're gaming the system.
Yeah, so a couple things. First, I will say that prior to the amendments in 2016, we saw that a lot of administrators weren't getting summative scores, like an alarming amount weren't receiving summative scores, and part of the QSAC process and our focus on principal evaluation, I think, helped out with a lot of that. But that still doesn't mean it's everybody. As far as, like, you know, legally, where we'd be at with that, I would refer you to the lawyers and the DOE to really kind of talk to you about those things. But if you do have some certain situations and it was a person who didn't receive a summative score and they were in those critical years where they needed one, I would tell you to contact us, and I can push you to the appropriate people, and we can see what
So I think that's a good piece of advice, so that even now, it's better, better late than never. It's still better to reach out to the department and say, all right, we know we should have done this earlier, but we're reaching out. We have somebody who did not receive a summative rating.
I've heard situations of teachers and such where, people going years without getting them, and then they get riffed and all these kinds of things, and they reach out to us, and we try to handle situations that we can, and I'd be more than happy to, offline with you if you've seen this is happening, quite a bit, and it wasn't brought to our attention.
Absolutely. So let me take a moment, Pete, to thank you. I know that this is just sort of the tip of the iceberg in walking through these issues. We have tried to put as much into 1 hour as we possibly could. And I know how incredibly busy you are. So it just means so much that you're willing to take this time to work with us and to answer questions from the field. For those whose questions we weren't able to get to today, we are capturing all these questions. We will share them with the department as well. I'm sure it will help the department as they're developing their FAQs and responding to the field. And we will be reviewing those questions on our own. And since we knew that there is so much to cover on these topics, we are, through FEA and Legal One, we are planning 2 in-depth follow-up sessions to today. So we do include information in this PowerPoint about a session we're doing on October 27th that'll walk more deeply through legal requirements, and a session on November 11th that'll walk much more deeply through best practices related to evaluation. So I want to thank you, Pete. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Thank you, John Farinella, as well. And we do look forward to working closely with the department as we move forward on these issues, trying to do everything we can to just navigate these incredibly difficult times and support all of those in the field. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, David.
Thanks so much. Everybody, please be safe.